Imagine a world where the most powerful military minds on Earth believed they had already figured out how to win the next war before a single shot was fired. Imagine generals so intoxicated by their own genius, so blinded by the ghost of a dead Prussian strategist, that they marched their armies straight into a catastrophe they had engineered themselves. And then imagine, on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, a group of young American aviators. Not admirals, not generals, not cavalry officers with rows of medals on their chests, but pilots, dreamers, theorists sitting in classrooms at a little-known school in Alabama, quietly writing the blueprint that would ultimately break the back of the most feared war machine in modern history. This is not a story you were taught in school. This is the story of two military philosophies that collided at 30,000 feet, and only one of them survived. Welcome, settle in, because what you are about to hear is one of the most fascinating, most overlooked, and most consequential intellectual battles in the entire history of modern warfare. We are going to travel back to the blood-soaked trenches of the First World War, forward into the corridors of German military planning in the 1930s, and across the Atlantic to the sun-baked runways of Maxwell Field, Alabama, where a small group of American airmen were quietly changing everything. This is the story of the Moltke Myth and the doctrine that defeated it. To understand everything that follows, we need to go back. Way back. We need to meet the man whose shadow hung over the German military like a god, Helmuth von Moltke the Elder. Born in 1800, this Prussian field marshal was not a battlefield brawler. He was a thinker, a chess player in a world full of checkers players. Moltke the Elder was a man who understood something that almost no military commander of his era grasped, that war was no longer about the brilliance of a single commander on a white horse. War, in the industrial age, was about systems, about railways and telegraphs and the movement of hundreds of thousands of men with mechanical precision. In 1866, Moltke crushed the Austrian Empire in just 7 weeks. 7 weeks. An empire that had stood for centuries, humiliated in less time than it takes most of us to form a new habit. 3 years later, in 1870, he did it again. He encircled and destroyed the French Imperial Army at Sedan, captured Napoleon III himself, and marched Prussian troops to the outskirts of Paris. The world was stunned. Military observers from every major power in Europe and America flooded into Germany to study what had happened. How had Prussia done it? What was the secret? And the answer they took home with them was what historians would later call the cult of Moltke. The idea that the German way of war, fast, decisive, operationally brilliant, was unbeatable. That encirclement, the great flanking maneuver, the battle of annihilation called Kesselschlacht, was the pinnacle of military art. Every subsequent generation of German officers was steeped in this tradition. They studied Moltke's campaigns the way theology students study scripture. They memorized his battles. They internalized his methods. And in doing so, they built a mythology, a belief system, around a style of warfare that had been brilliant in 1866 and 1870, but that contained hidden assumptions that would eventually prove catastrophically wrong. Because here is the thing about myths. They are powerful precisely because they contain a kernel of truth. Moltke really was a genius. The German military really did have extraordinary operational capability. But a myth is also, by definition, a story that has been frozen in time. It is a truth that has been elevated beyond its context, beyond its era, beyond its limitations. And when a military institution builds its entire identity around a myth, it becomes incapable of questioning that myth, even when the world has changed beneath its feet. The First World War was the first great crack in the Moltke myth. Germany entered that war in 1914 with the Schlieffen Plan, an enormous, sweeping attempt to recreate the great encirclements of 1866 and 1870, but on a continental scale. Knock out France in 6 weeks, then swing east to deal with Russia. Clean, decisive, Moltke-esque, and it failed. It failed not because the German generals were stupid. It failed because the world had changed. Machine guns, barbed wire, and the sheer size of modern armies turned the battlefield into a killing ground that no amount of operational brilliance could outmaneuver. For 4 years, millions of men died in the mud of the Western Front, and the beautiful Moltke tradition of decisive maneuver warfare ground itself to nothing. But here is where the story takes its most fascinating turn. After Germany lost the First World War, what did its military thinkers conclude? Did they question the fundamental assumptions of their tradition? Did they ask whether the Moltke myth itself needed to be re-examined? For the most part, the answer was no. The dominant conclusion in German military thinking after 1918 was not that their approach was wrong, but that their approach had been improperly executed. The Schlieffen Plan had not been bold enough, they said. The flanking maneuver had not been wide enough. The operational nerve of the commanders had broken at the critical moment. The solution was not to rethink the doctrine, it was to execute the doctrine better. To be more Moltke, not less. This is a profoundly human response to failure. We see it in business, in politics, in our personal lives. When a cherished belief system fails us, our first instinct is almost never to abandon the belief. It is to double down, to find a reason why the execution was flawed rather than the concept. The German military after 1918 was engaged in an enormous institutional act of motivated reasoning, and that motivated reasoning would have consequences that reverberated across the entire 20th century. Now, while Germany was doubling down on its operational tradition, something very different was happening across the Atlantic. The United States Army Air Corps had been established as a separate branch in 1926, and its officers were hungry for relevance, hungry for resources, hungry to prove that air power was not just a supporting arm for ground forces but a war-winning weapon in its own right. And in 1931, something happened that would change military history forever. The Air Corps Tactical School moved to Maxwell Field, Alabama. And the ideas that were born in those classrooms would eventually help end the Second World War. The Air Corps Tactical School, known simply as ACTS, was where the American military developed what would become strategic bombing doctrine. And the men who built that doctrine were, in many ways, the philosophical opposites of their German counterparts. Where the Germans were refining a tradition that stretched back generations, the American airmen were building something new. They were not constrained by a sacred institutional inheritance. They were free to think, to argue, to theorize, to be wrong, and to try again. The central idea that emerged from Maxwell Field was this: modern industrial nations were enormously complex systems. They depended on intricate networks of factories, railways, power plants, fuel depots, and communication lines. If you could identify the critical nodes of that industrial system, the points where destruction would cascade throughout the entire network, you could destroy an enemy's ability to make war without necessarily destroying his armies in the field or his cities on the ground. This was called the industrial web theory, and it was genuinely revolutionary. The men who developed this theory, officers like Harold George, Kenneth Walker, Haywood Hansel, and a young major named Lawrence Kuter, were doing something that the German military tradition was constitutionally incapable of doing. They were thinking about war not as a series of operational maneuvers, but as a systemic problem. They were asking not how to outflank an enemy army, but how to reach into the heart of an enemy nation and shut it down from within. Now, it is absolutely essential that we understand the context in which these ideas were developed. The American airmen at Maxwell Field were not omniscient. Their theory contained assumptions that would be severely tested by the reality of combat. They believed that their bombers, high-altitude, precision instruments, could fly unescorted deep into enemy territory and hit specific industrial targets with enough accuracy to be decisive. They believed that the self-defending bomber formation would be able to fight its way through enemy fighter defenses without prohibitive losses. Both of these assumptions would prove to be partially, sometimes catastrophically, wrong when put to the test over the skies of Europe between 1942 and 1944. But the crucial difference between the American airmen and the German generals was not that the Americans were always right. It was that the Americans were capable of learning. They had built a doctrine that was designed to be revised. They questioned their assumptions, adapted to new realities, and eventually, developed the strategic bombing campaign that did contribute meaningfully to Allied victory. Let us now return to Germany in the 1930s and watch the Moltke myth evolve into something new and terrifying. The rise of the National Socialists brought with it both resources and political permission for German military reconstruction. And the man who would most brilliantly synthesize the old Moltke tradition with modern technology was a small, precise, intensely focused general named Heinz Guderian. Guderian was obsessed with tanks. Not tanks as they had been used in the First World War, slow, unreliable infantry support weapons, but tanks as the new cavalry. Fast, concentrated, punching deep into enemy territory, disrupting command and communication, creating the chaos in which German operational brilliance could thrive. What Guderian built, in collaboration with other forward-thinking German officers, became known as Blitzkrieg, lightning war, and it was, on the surface, astonishing. When Germany unleashed it against Poland in September 1939, the campaign was over in weeks. When they turned it against France and the Low Countries in May 1940, they achieved in 6 weeks what 4 years of bloody fighting had failed to achieve in the previous war. The Moltke myth seemed, in those glorious and terrible spring days of 1940, to have been fully vindicated. The encirclement tradition was alive. Germany had found a way to be more Moltke, faster, more mechanized, more lethal. But if you look carefully at Blitzkrieg, if you read past the myth of German invincibility that immediately grew up around it, you begin to see the cracks. Blitzkrieg was an operational solution to a strategic problem that it could not actually solve. Could win battles, could even win campaigns. But it could not win a war against a major industrial power with strategic depth. And this is where the collision with American airpower doctrine becomes so profoundly interesting. Think about what each tradition assumed about the nature of war. The German tradition, rooted in Moltke, assumed that wars were decided by operational maneuvers, by great battles that destroyed or encircled enemy armies, breaking the enemy's will to resist in a single decisive blow. The American airpower tradition assumed that wars were decided by the destruction of industrial capacity, by systematically dismantling the economic and logistical infrastructure that made modern armies possible. These are not just different strategies. They are different theories of what war fundamentally is. And when Germany went to war against the Soviet Union in June 1941, those different theories began to produce their verdict. Operation Barbarossa was the most ambitious blitzkrieg in history. 3 army groups, 3 million men, advancing on a front of nearly 2,000 miles. And in the first weeks, it was extraordinary. The Germans encircled and destroyed Soviet army after Soviet army in battles that Moltke himself would have recognized. At Minsk, at Smolensk, at Kiev, at Vyazma-Bryansk, the numbers of Soviet prisoners taken were almost incomprehensible. At Kiev alone, the Germans claimed to have taken over 600,000 prisoners. 600,000 in a single battle. And yet the Soviet Union did not collapse. And this is the moment where the Moltke myth reveals its fatal flaw. Moltke's tradition of decisive battle had been developed in an era when defeating the enemy's army was sufficient to break the enemy's will. When Prussia defeated France at Sedan in 1870, France had no strategic depth, no industrial reserve capacity sufficient to reconstitute destroyed armies at scale, no ideological system that could mobilize the entire population for total war. But the Soviet Union in 1941 was a fundamentally different kind of enemy. It had vast strategic depth. It had an industrial base that had been relocated east of the Urals, beyond German reach. It had a political system brutal and coercive, yes, but also extraordinarily effective at mobilizing human and material resources for war. And it had population reserves that meant even the destruction of entire armies could be absorbed and reconstituted. The German operational tradition had no answer to this. This toolkit was the decisive battle. When the decisive battle failed to be decisive, the German military found itself in a war it had no doctrine to fight. By the winter of 1941, the Wehrmacht was frozen in front of Moscow, its supply lines stretched to breaking, its tank engines cracking in temperatures of -40 degrees, and the Soviet Union was not just surviving, it was rebuilding and preparing to fight back. Now let us cross back to the Atlantic and watch what the Americans were doing during these same years. The United States entered the war in December 1941, and the Army Air Forces, newly reorganized and expanded, were given a primary mission in the European theater, the strategic bombing of Germany. The men who had been at Maxwell Field, writing theory in Alabama classrooms, now found themselves responsible for executing that theory in the air over the most heavily defended airspace in the world. And reality was brutal. The early bombing raids over Germany revealed immediately that the theory of the self-defending bomber formation was wrong. When B-17 flying fortresses flew without fighter escort deep into Germany, to Schweinfurt, to Regensburg, to Münster, the losses were catastrophic. On what became known as Black Thursday, the second Schweinfurt raid of October 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 60 bombers in a single day. 60 aircraft, 600 men. That was not a sustainable loss rate. That was organizational hemorrhaging. But here is the critical point. When the American airmen encountered this catastrophic failure, what did they do? They stopped the deep penetration raids. They acknowledged that the theory was wrong. They did not double down on a failing approach, at least not permanently. And then, when a solution appeared, the long-range P-51 Mustang fighter, capable of escorting bombers all the way to Berlin and back, they embraced it immediately and decisively. By the spring of 1944, the 8th Air Force was not just bombing German industry. It was destroying the Luftwaffe fighter force in the air and on the ground, achieving the air superiority that made everything else possible. The contrast with the German military response to failure is instructive. When the Wehrmacht's operational approach failed to produce decisive results in the Soviet Union, the German High Command's response was to demand more of the same. More encirclement battles. More operational offensives. In 1942, the drive to Stalingrad and the Caucasus was another attempt to apply the same operational logic: seize decisive points, destroy the enemy's capacity to resist, force a conclusion. It produced instead the greatest encirclement in history in reverse, when the Soviets trapped the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad and destroyed it. The Moltke Myth had now cost Germany dearly, because embedded in that myth was an institutional incapacity for strategic adaptation. German generals were extraordinarily good at the operational level of war, the level between grand strategy and individual tactics, the level of campaigns and army group maneuvers. They were, arguably, the best operational commanders of the 20th century at their level. But operational excellence without strategic adaptability is like a race car with no steering wheel. It goes very fast right up until it hits the wall. Now, I want to take a moment to talk about something that historians often overlook when they tell the story, and that is the role of institutional culture in determining military effectiveness. The German military was built around a concept called Auftragstaktik, mission tactics. The idea was that a commander should be given an objective and then be free to use his judgment to achieve it without micromanagement from above. This was, in many ways, revolutionary and effective. It produced aggressive, initiative-driven officers who could act quickly in the chaos of battle. And it worked brilliantly at the operational level. But Auftragstaktik also had a blind spot. It produced officers who were extraordinarily comfortable with tactical and operational freedom, but who had been systematically trained to leave strategic questions to their superiors. German officers were not encouraged to think about war aims, about grand strategy, about the relationship between military means and political ends. They were trained to fight battles. And when the battles they were winning were not producing victory, when the strategic situation kept deteriorating despite operational success after operational success, the German officer corps had no institutional framework for understanding why or what to do about it. The Americans, by contrast, were building something different at Maxwell Field and its institutional successors. The Air Corps Tactical School was explicitly a place for strategic thinking. Its instructors and students were engaged with questions not just of how to fly and fight, but of what air power could achieve at the strategic level, how it connected to national policy, to industrial capacity, to the long arc of a war's outcome. This was messy and imprecise and often wrong in its details. But the habit of thinking strategically, the institutional permission to question fundamental assumptions, was built into the American airpower tradition in a way that was absent from the German operational tradition. And this difference in institutional culture showed up in how each side responded to the specific challenge of the air war over Europe. The Luftwaffe had been designed as a tactical air force, a flying artillery force intended to support ground operations, to fly ahead of the panzers, to bomb enemy forward positions and suppress resistance. It had brilliant pilots, excellent aircraft, innovative tactical concepts. What it did not have was a strategic vision for what air power could accomplish independently. When Germany tried to shift the Luftwaffe to strategic bombing during the Battle of Britain in 1940, it did so without a coherent theory of strategic targeting and without the aircraft designed for that mission. The Blitz on British cities was not a strategic bombing campaign in the Maxwell Field sense. It was operational bombardment applied at a strategic level, without the intellectual framework to make it work. Meanwhile, back in the United States, even as the early strategic bombing campaigns were struggling and bleeding over Germany, the foundational architecture of the air campaign was being refined and improved. The targeting committees were studying German industry with extraordinary sophistication, trying to identify those critical nodes where destruction would cascade through the entire system. The oil campaign, the decision in the spring of 1944 to prioritize the destruction of German synthetic fuel production, was a textbook application of the industrial web theory. Hit the fuel and everything stops. Tanks cannot move. Aircraft cannot fly. The entire Wehrmacht, that magnificent operational machine, becomes a collection of stationary metal objects waiting to be destroyed. And it worked. By the summer and fall of 1944, German fuel production had been reduced to a fraction of its previous output. The Luftwaffe, which had been conserving fuel for the defense of the Reich, found itself unable to train new pilots adequately because training flights had to be curtailed. German armored units found themselves stranded with empty fuel tanks. The operational genius of German generals became irrelevant when their armies could not move. Now let us talk about the human dimension of this story, because history is not just about institutions and doctrines. It is about people. And the contrast between the human beings who embodied these two traditions is as revealing as the abstract principles they followed. Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, perhaps the most famous German general of the war, was a perfect embodiment of the Moltke tradition. He was an operational artist of the highest order. In North Africa, outnumbered and outgunned, he maneuvered his forces with a speed and audacity that left British commanders perpetually off balance. He thought in terms of momentum, of surprise, of hitting the enemy where they were weak and exploiting success before it could be consolidated. He was, by any measure, a military genius at the operational level. But Rommel had almost no strategic vision. He consistently urged his superiors to send more resources to North Africa, arguing that if Germany could capture the Suez Canal and push into the Middle East, the strategic consequences would be decisive. He was not entirely wrong about the potential importance of that theater. But he never fully grasped why Germany could not prioritize North Africa, the enormous resource demands of the Soviet front, the fundamental mismatch between German strategic ambitions and German strategic resources, the impossibility of sustaining a major campaign across a Mediterranean dominated by British air power and naval power. He was a master of the operational frame and almost blind outside it. Contrast Rommel with someone like General Karl Spaatz, the commander of United States strategic air forces in Europe. Spaatz was not a charismatic battlefield commander. He was an administrator, a strategist, a man who thought in systems. He argued persistently and sometimes against the wishes of his superiors for the oil campaign, because his understanding of the German industrial system told him it was the right target. He was willing to accept short-term tactical costs, the diversion of bombers from other targets, for long-term strategic gains. He thought in time horizons that extended beyond the next battle to the overall arc of the war. This was a fundamentally different kind of military thinking, and it was this kind of thinking that the American air power tradition had developed and institutionalized. Now, I want to address something that sometimes gets lost when people discuss the strategic bombing campaign, and that is the question of whether it actually worked. This is a genuinely complicated historical question, and I want to be honest with you about its complexity. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted after the war, produced conclusions that have been debated by historians for 8 decades. Some aspects of the industrial web theory were validated. The oil campaign really did cripple German military operations. The destruction of the German transportation network in the final months of the war really did paralyze the German economy. But other aspects of the theory were not validated. Precision bombing was far less precise than the Maxwell Field theorists had imagined, and the morale effects of bombing on civilian populations were different from what had been predicted. What the bombing campaign unambiguously achieved, however, was something that the industrial web theorists had not fully anticipated. It destroyed the Luftwaffe. The decision in early 1944 to use the long-range bomber missions as bait, to draw out the German fighter force and destroy it in air-to-air combat, was a strategic masterstroke. General Jimmy Doolittle's decision to unleash the P-51 escorts to hunt German fighters rather than stay close to the bombers transformed the air war. By D-Day in June 1944, the Allies had achieved air superiority over France that made the amphibious invasion possible. German columns moving toward the beaches were strafed and bombed with near impunity. German commanders reported that daylight movement had become almost impossible. The operational genius of Rommel and his colleagues was being negated not by better German operational thinking, but by American strategic thinking that had removed the conditions in which German operational thinking could function. This is the heart of what I want you to understand. The Moltke Myth was not defeated by better operational art. It was not defeated by a commander who outmaneuvered the German generals at their own game. It was defeated by a different theory of war, one that operated at a different level, that asked different questions, that reached around the operational excellence of the German military and dismantled the systems that made that excellence possible. This is not to say that the American approach was without flaws. The strategic bombing campaign killed hundreds of thousands of German civilians. It consumed enormous resources, aircraft, fuel, trained aircrews that might have been deployed in other ways. The early campaign, before the P-51 arrived and before the oil targeting began, was enormously costly and of debatable effectiveness. And the moral questions raised by area bombing, by the firestorms at Hamburg and Dresden and other German cities, are questions that historians and ethicists continue to wrestle with and that do not have simple answers. But the intellectual competition between the Moltke tradition and the Maxwell Field tradition, the competition between operational genius and strategic systems thinking, produced a clear result. By 1944 and 1945, Germany's extraordinary military machine, descendant of Moltke's tradition, was being ground to nothing, not primarily because it was outfought on the battlefield, but because it operated within a strategic environment that had been shaped and reshaped by American airpower doctrine. The German generals could still fight brilliantly. They often did. But the context in which they fought had been transformed. Consider the final year of the war in Europe. German generals continued to display remarkable operational skill even in defeat. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last great offensive in December 1944, was an audacious operational gamble that briefly dislocated the Allied advance and sent shockwaves through the Allied high command. Brilliant German commanders like Model and Manschufel executed the initial breakthrough with skill and precision. But the Bulge ultimately failed not because the German operational execution was poor, but because German armor ran out of fuel before it could reach its objectives, because Allied air power, grounded initially by bad weather but unleashed when the skies cleared, savaged German armored columns on the roads, and because the industrial disparity between the two sides meant that German losses in the Bulge could not be replaced while Allied losses could be made good almost immediately. The Moltke tradition had delivered its last great operational performance, and it had been defeated by strategic reality. Now I want to zoom out and think about the broader lessons of this story, because history is most valuable when it helps us understand not just what happened in the past, but what happens in human institutions and human thinking more generally. The story of the Moltke Myth and the Maxwell Field doctrine is ultimately a story about two different relationships with intellectual tradition, two different institutional cultures in their capacity for learning and adaptation. The German military's relationship with its Moltke inheritance was one of veneration, a kind of institutional ancestor worship that produced extraordinary performance within the tradition but catastrophic rigidity outside it. The tradition told German officers what war was, what questions to ask, what solutions to seek. And it did so with such authority and such historical prestige that questioning the tradition felt almost like heresy. German officers who tried to think outside the operational box, who tried to engage with strategic questions, who argued that the fundamental approach needed rethinking, found themselves marginalized or ignored. The American air power tradition, by contrast, was young and therefore humble. It had no sacred canon to defend, no centuries of institutional glory to protect. The men at Maxwell Field knew they were building something new, knew that their theories were unproven, knew that they would have to revise and adapt. This is a posture of intellectual openness that is enormously difficult to maintain in an institution with deep traditions and high stakes. But it is also, as this story illustrates, potentially decisive. There is a concept in organizational learning theory called a dominant logic, a shared set of assumptions about how the world works that shapes everything an organization does, from the questions it asks to the solutions it considers to the information it pays attention to. Dominant logics are not inherently bad. They emerge because they work, because they capture real patterns in the world that allow organizations to function effectively. But every dominant logic has boundary conditions, circumstances in which its assumptions no longer hold, in which the world has changed faster than the logic has. The Moltke tradition was a dominant logic that had served the German military brilliantly within specific historical conditions. When those conditions changed, when the enemies became too large, too industrial, too strategically deep to be defeated by operational encirclement, the dominant logic became a trap. The strategic bombing doctrine of the American Air Forces was, in a sense, an anti-dominant logic, a framework that was explicitly designed to challenge existing assumptions about how wars were won. It was not successful because it was always right. It was successful because it asked different questions. And asking different questions, even when you don't immediately have the right answers, is how intellectual progress happens. One more figure deserves our attention in this story, because he represents perhaps the most poignant embodiment of the Moltke tradition's internal tragedy. His name was Franz Halder, and he was chief of the German General Staff from 1938 to 1942. Halder was, by any objective standard, one of the finest operational planners of his generation. He was the man who developed the plan for the invasion of France, a plan so audacious, so operationally sophisticated, that even many of its own architects thought it was too bold. And it worked brilliantly. But Halder also understood, at some level, the strategic limitations of the approach he was helping to execute. He kept a meticulous diary throughout his tenure, and reading it today is a study in a brilliant man who could see the strategic problems clearly but had no framework for solving them, no language for translating strategic concern into operational action, no institutional permission to step outside the dominant logic of his tradition. When Halder finally raised concerns about the strategic direction of the Soviet campaign in 1942, when he told Hitler that German forces were being asked to do the operationally impossible, he was dismissed. Hitler called him a defeatist. But Halder's problem was not timidity. His problem was that he had spent his entire career being trained to think operationally, and when the operational tradition ran out of answers, he had nowhere to turn. The Moltke tradition had not given him the tools to think his way out of the strategic dilemma Germany had created for itself. Compare this to the trajectory of someone like General Haywood Hansell, one of the key architects of American strategic bombing doctrine. Hansell commanded the 20th Air Force in the Pacific and initially insisted on applying precision bombing theory against Japan, even when results were disappointing. He was eventually relieved of command and replaced by Curtis LeMay, who shifted to incendiary area bombing of Japanese cities, a less theoretically elegant approach but one that produced devastating results. Hansell was deeply troubled by this, both professionally and morally. But the point is that the American system allowed for that kind of contest, allowed LeMay's pragmatic adaptation to challenge and supersede Hansell's theoretical purism. The system corrected itself. Not perfectly, not without pain, but it corrected itself. That capacity for self-correction, built into the culture of American airpower from its Maxwell Field origins, was itself a strategic asset of the First Order. We are now in the final act of this story, and I want to bring you to its conclusion with the weight it deserves. By the spring of 1945, the result of the intellectual and material competition between the Moltke tradition and the American airpower doctrine was written in the rubble of German cities, in the empty fuel tanks of German panzer divisions, in the silence of factories that had once produced the weapons of the Wehrmacht, in the contrails of American bombers flying unopposed over a country that had once seemed invincible. The German military had fought with extraordinary courage and skill to the very end. Individual German soldiers and officers continued to display operational excellence even as the Reich crumbled around them. But the strategic framework within which they fought had been systematically dismantled. The Moltke Myth had promised that operational genius could substitute for strategic wisdom, that if you fought battles brilliantly enough, if you encircled and destroyed enemy armies with enough skill and speed, you could force a decision before the enemy's industrial and demographic advantages could tell. The American airpower doctrine had challenged that promise at its root, had reached past the operational level to the industrial and logistical foundations that made military operations possible, and had begun systematically destroying those foundations until there was nothing left for German operational genius to work with. There is a footnote to this story that I think deserves to be told. After the war, the United States Strategic Bombing Survey interviewed hundreds of German military and civilian officials to assess the effects of the bombing campaign. Among the most interesting findings was what Germans themselves said about which aspects of the bombing had been most damaging. The oil campaign topped the list. The transportation campaign was close behind. German officers were almost unanimous in their assessment. Once the fuel was gone and the railways were broken, the war was over. Not because German soldiers stopped fighting, not because German generals stopped planning, but because the operational machine had been deprived of the material foundation without which no operational tradition, however brilliant, can function. The Moltke tradition had assumed that the decisive element of war was the clash of armies in the field. The Maxwell Field tradition had assumed that the decisive element was the industrial system that sustained those armies. Both were partly right, but in the specific historical conditions of the Second World War, with its scale, its duration, and its industrial character, the Maxwell Field assumption proved to be more fundamental. You can lose battles and still win wars if your industrial base is intact and growing. You cannot win battles indefinitely if your industrial base is being destroyed faster than it can be rebuilt. Germany learned this lesson. It learned it at enormous cost to itself and to the world. And so we arrive at the end of this journey, from the Prussian staff rides of the 1860s, through the blood and mud of the Somme and Verdun, through the classrooms of Maxwell Field, Alabama, through the contrails and flak bursts over Schweinfurt and Ploiesti in Berlin, to the final silence of May 1945. The Moltke Myth was not wrong, it was incomplete. Captured real truths about operational warfare that remain valid to this day. But it failed to capture the larger truth about industrial age war, which is that operational excellence is a means to strategic ends, not an end in itself. When German generals pursued operational excellence as an end in itself, as the expression of a military tradition that had become its own justification, they built a machine of extraordinary power that destroyed itself against the strategic reality it was not equipped to understand. The American airpower theorists at Maxwell Field were not smarter than Moltke or Schlieffen or Guderian, but they were asking better questions. They were thinking about war as a system, about the enemy as an organism rather than an army, about victory as the product of strategic logic rather than operational brilliance. And in doing so, they built a doctrine that, for all its flaws and all the terrible costs of its execution, pointed toward the future of warfare in ways that the magnificent, deadly, ultimately doomed Moltke tradition could not. The ghost of Moltke still walks the corridors of military thinking. His insights about initiative, about mission command, about the importance of speed and decision at the operational level are still valid and still taught. But the myth, the idea that operational genius alone can substitute for strategic wisdom, that the brilliant battle can substitute for the patient dismantling of an enemy's will and capacity, That myth died in the skies over Germany between 1943 and 1945. It was killed by a group of American airmen who had the audacity to think differently, to build something new, to ask questions that had never been asked before, and to keep asking them even when the first answers were wrong. That ultimately is the deepest lesson of this story. Not about airplanes or doctrine or operational art, but about the courage to question what everybody assumes is true, the institutional courage to say that perhaps the most revered tradition in the room is not adequate for the challenge in front of us. That courage, in the American airpower tradition, proved to be worth more than 1,000 brilliant encirclements. It is worth thinking about in military history, yes, but also in any institution, in any era, in any endeavor where the world has moved on but the tradition has not. So here is the question I want to leave with you. Given everything you have heard today, the extraordinary operational genius of the German military tradition and the strategic systems thinking of the American airpower theorists, if you had been a military planner in 1939, before the war began, which approach would you have believed in? And more importantly, are there Moltke myths in your own field today? Traditions so revered, so embedded in institutional culture, so seemingly validated by past success, that questioning them feels almost unthinkable? Because the history of the Moltke myth and the Maxwell Field doctrine suggests that the most dangerous moment for any tradition is not when it is failing, but when it is succeeding so brilliantly that no one thinks to ask whether the world has changed beneath it. If this story made you think differently about military history, about institutional culture, about the nature of strategic thinking, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want to go deeper into the stories that changed the course of the 20th century, you know where to find them. The past is never finished with us. Stay curious,